What was the deadliest war in American history? If you said the Civil War, that's a great guess, but it's not the right answer. Believe it or not, the conflict with the highest death rate per capita, a war so devastating it changed the course of this continent forever, is one that most of us never learned about in school. It was a war that saw entire towns wiped off the map, where the very survival of the English colonies hung by a thread. This is the story of King Philip's War, the forgotten conflict that shaped America. To understand this war, we need to go back to the mid-1600s in New England. For about 50 years, there was a fragile peace between the English colonists and the native Wampanoag people. You might remember the story of the first Thanksgiving in 1621. That was a moment of cooperation between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag, led by their sachem, or chief, Massasoit. Massasoit had made a crucial alliance with the colonists, seeing them as potential allies against rival native tribes. For decades, this alliance held, but the ground beneath it was constantly shifting. The English population was exploding. They were hungry for land, and their towns and farms kept expanding deeper and deeper into ancestral native territories. Their way of life was completely different. The colonists saw land as something to be owned, fenced off, and cultivated privately. For the Native Americans, land was a communal resource, something to be shared and used by the tribe, not possessed by an individual. These clashing worldviews were a recipe for conflict. Adding to the tension, the English brought their laws and legal systems with them. They began imposing their rules on the native peoples, who had their own long-standing traditions of justice and governance. Imagine being told that the laws your ancestors had followed for generations were suddenly invalid, and you had to follow a completely foreign set of rules, often in a language you didn't understand. The colonists also made aggressive efforts to convert Native Americans to Christianity, creating what were called praying towns. While some converted willingly, many saw this as a direct assault on their cultural identity and spiritual beliefs. The leader of the Wampanoag at this time was a man named Metacomet. The English called him King Philip. He was the son of Massasoit, the very same chief who had first welcomed the Pilgrims. But Metacomet grew up in a different world than his father. He saw his people's land shrinking, their resources dwindling, and their traditions being eroded day by day. He watched as the English legal system was used to chip away at native sovereignty. There was a growing sense of frustration and desperation among the tribes. They felt they were being pushed to the brink, with their backs against the sea. The breaking point came in 1675. A Christianized Native American named John Sassaman, who acted as an interpreter and informant for the colonists, warned the governor of Plymouth that Metacomet was planning a war. Shortly after, Sassaman was found dead. The Plymouth colony took matters into their own hands. They arrested 3 of Metacomet's top men, put them on trial with a jury that included some native converts, and executed them for murder. For Metacomet and the Wampanoag, this was the ultimate insult. It was a complete violation of their sovereignty. The English had no right, in their eyes, to try and execute their people. It was the final straw. The young men of the tribe were boiling with rage, and Metacomet, seeing no other option to preserve his people's way of life, decided to unite the tribes of the region and fight back. The war had begun. The initial attacks were swift and brutal. Wampanoag warriors, eventually joined by allies from the Nipmuck and Narragansett tribes, launched lightning raids on colonial settlements across Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. They used guerrilla tactics, their knowledge of the landscape giving them a massive advantage. They would strike a town, burn it to the ground, and then melt back into the forest before the colonial militia could even organize a response. The colonists were terrified. They were used to a different kind of warfare, fighting in open fields and organized lines. This was something else entirely. Settlements like Swansea, Brookfield, and Lancaster were utterly destroyed. Survivors' accounts from this period are harrowing, describing ambushes and attacks that left them in a state of constant fear. For a time, it seemed like the Native American alliance was unstoppable. It pushed the line of English settlement back almost to the coast. Half of all towns in New England were attacked, and more than a dozen were completely wiped out. The colonial project in America was on the verge of collapse. The turning point of the war came in the winter of 1675, with an event known as the Great Swamp Fight. The powerful Narragansett tribe had tried to remain neutral, but the colonists, paranoid and desperate, decided they couldn't be trusted. They launched a preemptive strike on the main Narragansett fort, a large, fortified village hidden deep within a frozen swamp in what is now Rhode Island. the battle was a bloodbath. The colonial militia stormed the fort and set it ablaze. Hundreds of Narragansett warriors, but also women and children, were killed in the fighting or died from exposure after their winter supplies and homes were destroyed. While it was a tactical victory for the colonists, it was also a strategic disaster. The surviving Narragansett warriors, now filled with a desire for revenge, threw their full support behind Metacomet. The spring of 1676 saw the fighting reach its peak intensity. The war had become a desperate struggle for survival on both sides, with atrocities committed by everyone involved. It was total war, with no distinction between combatants and civilians. However, the tide slowly began to turn against the native Hurons. They were warriors, not farmers. A year of constant fighting meant they hadn't been able to plant their crops. As their food supplies ran out, starvation and disease began to take a heavy toll. At the same time, the colonists started to adapt. They enlisted the help of other native tribes like the Mohegan and Pequot, who were rivals of the Wampanoag. They also began to copy the guerrilla tactics of their enemies, forming small, mobile ranger units that could track war parties through the wilderness. The alliance Metacomet had so carefully built began to fracture. Tribes started to surrender, and some even began to fight alongside the English, hoping for better treatment. In August of 1676, Metacomet himself was hunted down. Betrayed by one of his own men, he was ambushed and killed near his ancestral home at Mount Hope, Rhode Island. His death effectively ended the war. The resistance collapsed. The aftermath was catastrophic. Let's talk about the numbers, because they are staggering. In just over a year, around 800 colonists were killed. That might not sound like a huge number today, but at the time, it represented about 5% of the entire male population. But the devastation for the Native Americans was on a completely different scale. At least 3,000 were killed in the fighting. But that's not all. The English sold thousands more, including Metacomet's own wife and 9-year-old son, into slavery in the West Indies. It was a deliberate policy to remove the native population from the land. Entire tribes were effectively wiped out or forced to flee and merge with other groups. Their political independence was shattered. Their land was seized. The delicate balance that had existed for 50 years was gone forever. For the colonists, the victory came at a terrible cost, but it solidified their control over New England and paved the way for unchecked westward expansion. So why isn't this devastating war more widely known? Why isn't Metacomet as famous as George Washington or Abraham Lincoln? There are a few reasons. First, the winners write the history books. For centuries, the story was told from the colonists' perspective, portraying it as a righteous victory over savages. The complex motivations and the humanity of the native side were completely erased. Second, American history tends to focus on the story of the nation's founding, the Revolution and the Civil War. A brutal colonial-era war that doesn't fit neatly into that triumphant narrative is often pushed to the margins. But King Philip's War is not just a forgotten footnote. It's a crucial, foundational story of America. It reveals the deep-seated conflicts over land, culture, and power that have defined so much of this country's history. It forces us to confront the brutal realities of colonization and its human cost. Understanding this war gives us a much richer and more honest picture of how the United States came. It was, without a doubt, the deadliest and one of the most significant wars in American history. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into a forgotten piece of history interesting, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that you might not have learned in school. See you next time.